welcome to CIGI's second virtual event, The Data Imperative in the Post-COVID Economy. My name is Andrea Harding, and I lead the Community Relations and Events team for CIGI. I would like to acknowledge that the CIGI campus is located on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. CIGI is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River. Since this is a virtual event, you might be viewing this from another territory. And if so, I encourage you to do some research on the territory in which you live, work, and play on. Indigenous communities are being hit particularly hard by the pandemic, and we have a responsibility to ensure their voices are heard as we navigate through these times. One of the virtual events that we have coming up is a partnership with Laurier to recognize National Indigenous Peoples Day on June 21st. We're still finalizing the details, but please keep an eye on cigiponline.org/events for registration information. And of course, if you haven't already, please subscribe to our newsletter. I'd also like to take a moment to highlight the Big Tech podcast. For those of you who have joined our events before, you've probably heard of it and check it out bi-weekly. But if you haven't, it's a bi-weekly podcast that explores how emerging technologies are reshaping democracy, the economy, and society. It is hosted by CIGI Senior Fellow, CIGI Fellow Taylor Owen, and David Skock, the editor-in-chief of The Logic. The latest episode features Joseph Stiglitz, a Nobel laureate economist and professor at Columbia University. You can listen and subscribe to it at www.bigtechpodcast.com. Before we begin the program, CIGI would like to thank all the frontline and essential workers for their commitment and courage in keeping us all safe. We are staying home and attending virtual events for you. So the order for this evening is we're going to begin with a presentation from CIGI Senior Fellow Dan Ciuriak and CIGI Director of Research for Digital Economy Bob Fay on how data has changed the economy and how COVID-19 has expedited the digital transformation. They will discuss how policy will require even greater focus on the data-driven economy in order to ensure long-term growth. Dan is a Senior Fellow at CIGI, where he's exploring the interface between Canada's domestic innovation and international trade and investment, including the development of better metrics to assess the impact of Canada's trade agreements on innovation outcomes. Based in Ottawa, Dan is the Director and Principal of Ciuriak Consulting, Inc. Bob is the Director of Research for Digital Economy at CIGI and responsible for the research direction and related activities. He has extensive experience in macro and microeconomic research and policy analysis. Prior to joining CIGI, Bob has held several senior roles at the Bank of Canada, most recently as the Senior Director overseeing work to assess developments and implications arising from the digitalization of the Canadian economy. Dan and Bob have also written about COVID and the economy in the recent months, and these publications you've been able to see in some of the newspapers such as the Globe and Mail, but also are found online at cigionline.org. Following the presentation, we will open it up to questions from our audience. You can submit these questions by clicking on the Q&A icon, which is at the bottom of your window. To keep things flowing, I would encourage you to type your questions as you think of them during the presentation, and then I'll read them off once it's done, and Bob and Dan will take turns answering them. As with our past community events, this event is going to be recorded and will be on our website within a few days. So with that, I will now turn it over to Dan.
So thank you very much, Andrea, for that introduction. And it's a great pleasure to be with this group this evening. And as we can see, the digital transformation is enabling us to get on with life at a time when the pandemic otherwise would really have shut things down. So from one perspective, we could not be better off than we are right now in terms of keeping our economy going and keeping our activities going. So today we want to talk about the intangibles economy. And we've actually been talking about intangibles for a long time, but primarily with regard to services as intangible products. But today we want to focus on intangible assets. These are productive assets. Now, we've actually also been in an intangibles economy for some time. When we can date the beginning of the knowledge-based economy when intellectual property became a key asset back to at least 1980, and that would be in the leading jurisdiction for IP, and that was the United States. So in the knowledge-based economy, a company's knowledge assets are its critical features. These include its technology, its specific human capital, its organizational capital, and these combine to give a company a competitive edge. And this is really important in the last several decades as you had the low-wage economies of East Asia breaking onto the scene. And this is what kept the competitive advantage in the advanced industrialized countries, was the fact that they were moving up the curve on intellectual property, on these intangible assets. So in terms of the policy for this economy, the intangibles economy based upon knowledge assets, was primarily to focus on increasing the inputs that produce this knowledge. And that included research and development. We had all kinds of programs to support the private sector investment in information technology and R&D, acquisition of software, and of course, supporting education with particular focus on STEM skills to provide the person power for this economy. At the same time, because intellectual property has public good characteristics, it's non-rivalrous, two people can use the same piece of intellectual property at the same time, its value depends upon protection. So through this period, Canada, along with other industrialized countries that depended upon knowledge, increased the scope and intensity of protection for intellectual property. So now, over the course of the past few decades, there's been a new form of intangible asset has come on the scene. It's become increasingly important, and that's data. And data is generated, as we know, from the myriad daily routines of digitally connected individuals and machines. So these now ubiquitous devices capture data not only from computers and smartphones connected to the internet and social media platforms, but also fitness trackers, security cameras in buildings, surveillance satellites, sensors in pipelines, chips and smart equipment of all kinds, from cars to tractors to refrigerators even, which drive smart homes. So the spread of these devices has enabled the datafication of practically all human social, political, and economic activity. And with this ubiquitous monitoring, it's only a modest exaggeration to say if it moves, it's measured. And because of the steeply declining cost of storage of data, it's being accumulated in amounts that are truly astronomical. It's typically said that 90% of all data has been accumulated in the last couple of years, and that statement has been true for the better part of a decade. So why is data so important? Well, there's several reasons. One of them, and we'll get to this more as we talk about the data-driven economy, but a critical factor is that it underpins the development of the new technologies of our age, artificial intelligence and machine learning techniques. And these in particular now underpin the most sophisticated technologies of our age. If you think about how computer chips themselves are designed, they're now designed largely by algorithms, which machine learning, humans don't design these fantastically complex devices. So you have machine learning algorithms, which then train other machine learning algorithms, which then actually design these products. So having this particular technology is critical to technology leadership, and that, of course, also then is the source of the major conflict of our age, which is the technology war between the United States and China. So I want to focus then on a key concept of this asset-based economy, and that is that you have to accumulate the assets. In prior ages, when land was the essential asset, countries fought over land. And then when markets, with the industrial economy, when markets, mass production machinery was the key asset, countries fought over, it was mercantilist, you had to capture markets. We had gunboat diplomacy to open up markets, for example, the opium wars in China and so forth. With the knowledge-based economy, the critical asset was IP, and you had to accumulate it, but you had to spread the protection of this globally. And so this was the age of trade agreements. The agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement basically worked to spread the observance and the protection for intellectual property. And now with the data-driven economy, it's all about acquiring data and capturing data. So it's accumulation. And here's a kind of a story to think about how Canada has played the game. We have not been accumulating our these intangible assets. And that's one thing that we'll talk a bit about in terms of how you prosper in this age. So if I can now move to the second slide on intellectual property. So Intellectual property is at the heart of this intangibles economy. And it's surprising how different this particular economy is from the old industrial economy that we grew up with as economists and as policymakers in the post-war period. So the first thing is think about ownership. In the world of tangible goods, ownership is exclusive. Only one person can own a cell phone. Only one person can use, a private good like a car. You can lock it up and prevent others from using it. But as mentioned, with intangibles, with intellectual property, ownership depends upon denying access to others. It's a negative right, as opposed to a positive one. As regards to source of income, in the world of tangibles, it comes from mass production, expansion of market share. This is the world that drove the globalization and development of global value chains, which actually spread activity around the world. But in the world of intangibles, it comes from the capture of economic rent. And that means, and that rent only exists because of the protection of IP. So rather than expanding markets, you're now trying to protect an asset. We can talk about asset value protection agreements as being the characteristic of the new types of trade agreements. Now, a company operating in the tangible sphere is focused on producing and selling its goods. It's moving inventory. In the world of intangibles, the objective is to acquire a war chest of intellectual property that can be then deployed either for licensing or for supporting own production. And of course, this leads to strategies such as the patent trolls, companies that acquire lots and lots of non-performing IP at low prices, and then watch for a company that actually develops a product and then moves in on them. So it changes the business strategies of companies even. With traditional goods move through the conventional backbone infrastructure of an economy. And that means that production is rooted in some sense in the places where the infrastructure is. But IP can be located anywhere. Today, it could be in the US, tomorrow it could be in Ireland, the following day somewhere in a tax haven in the Caribbean. There was this one interesting story where at one point the shift of US intellectual property to Ireland caused a massive one-year surge in Irish GDP. This was for tax reasons. And of course, the Irish economy didn't actually feel this boost, but that's an indication of the value of this IP when it's embedded in the economy. But actually, the interesting thing, of course, is who owns it, not where it's located. So in terms of with traditional goods production, the search for efficiency led, as I mentioned, to global value chains, and that spread wealth. But intellectual property is based on a winner-take-most or winner-take-all economics. And once the IP is produced, there's no more wages to be paid. There's no more just rents to be collected. So in a value chain world, you've established factories and you keep paying those wages. In the IP world, if you are a tech engineer who produces an IP for Microsoft, once that IP is produced, it's gone. You're no longer employed. You're no longer getting wages. Microsoft is picking up the rent. So in the in the traditional economy, the trade agreements focus on increasing competition. They actually want to erode the value of vested interests by creating more competition, by providing market access. But in the intangibles economy, the trade agreement works the opposite way. It restricts it. It puts up new barriers to the leakage of intellectual property, including through the investment provisions and others, which seek to ensure that a multinational company entering an economy is able to preserve the value of its own IP. So here again, we have the difference between trade increasing competition versus the trade agreement now actually working to reduce competition. So we can move to the next slide, which talks about the value of intangible assets. So in the 1970s, the value of intangible assets as a share of market capitalization was in the 20-30% range. But over the decades, it has risen very, very steeply. And now in the last few years, it's been over 90%. That this is, of course, in the leading jurisdiction for intellectual property and data, the United States, the S&P 500. But if you take a look at the valuation of these major data-driven, intellectual property-driven companies, their market cap is on the order of trillions of dollars, but they have virtually no physical assets, and of course they have very, very few employees. So data is now data and intellectual property, which combine is very, very valuable. Now the question is, where do we see the value of this data? Intellectual property is a line item for intangible asset value, but data is nowhere. There is nowhere a collection based upon payments with a paper trail of invoices and receipts. It's only visible indirectly through the market valuation of these companies. But the major companies that have accumulated data, the Facebooks, the Microsofts, et cetera, the Amazons, who use these assets to capture market share globally, they are valued by the market, and a lot of that valuation is based on data. And if you in the mergers and acquisition area, you oftentimes hear of a company being acquired for several billions of dollars, and the acquisition is described as a data play. So let's move on to the next one, and this is about Canada's position here. So in, is this the one on Canada? So intangible investments, what we see is that Canada has not been making those same level of intangible investments, and we certainly have not been acquiring the intangible assets that the United States has. In many ways, we are an intangible asset poor economy. And while we've done well as in terms of working to produce many of these advances, technological advances, for example, in artificial intelligence, Canada has not been the place where these patents and these assets have actually landed and where they continue to generate rents. So as we see from the other part of the slide, is that Canada has been very, very weak in terms of developing its asset portfolios. So that doesn't bode very well for the future for us, because if you think about the way an asset game is played, think about the game of Monopoly. Canada goes around the board, collects us $200 a go for developing AI, but we don't wind up buying up the assets. So the United States goes around the board, buys up all the properties, and then charges rent. So guess who wins in this particular game? Of course, it's the country that invests in the assets. So basically, understanding the source of prosperity in a data-driven world is very important to shaping your strategy. So now let's move on to the data-driven economy and the characteristics of this economy. So it features a number of characteristics that lead towards market failure, big time. So let's think about, first of all, the economies of scale. The value of data, it drives the quality of predictions. The more data you have, the better your predictions are, the more you can use that to capture market share in whatever business you are. But there's a high cost of actually maintaining of acquiring that data in the first place. Think of Google's gleaming server banks. That requires a lot of investment, and then of course it requires a lot of investment in the AI expertise to actually make use of that, the data-driven strategies. The second feature of this economy is economies of scope. Data, the value of data is increased by when it's cross-referenced against other types of data. Think here about Facebook's interest in acquiring financial data on its user base. That financial data would enable Facebook to better utilize its already existing data, and that would make it a lot more powerful. So as the value of cross-referencing of data grows, again, the company with the most types of data, the largest quantity of data, becomes the superstar firm in its area. Then there's knowledge externalities. The data-driven world is unique in some ways. Knowledge externalities were always a major driver of industrial development. Alfred Marshall remarked first on this in the industrial zones in England. he said knowledge was in the air, and that's what made cities like Manchester vital areas. It's what makes Silicon Valley. It's what makes the Cambridge area around Boston very, very dynamic. It's these knowledge externalities. With data, now companies can capture these local externalities globally, so they can extract the value. You can actually, you understand the local dynamics of an economy from the data you're picking up, and you can use that to sell advertising, for example, whether it's in Pretoria or in anywhere in the world, basically, from a location which is elsewhere. So the value of local externalities has been captured globally, and that's a big difference in the way this economy works. And then this network externalities. So this is an obvious one and a major one. The more players that are on a system, the more valuable it is. So again, once you get a leadership position established, there's a strong tendency for the market to tip and you becoming the sole provider. And so we have, a company like Facebook now can boast that it has more clients than the populations of the United States, China, and the European Union combined. And that's an amazing feature of this particular kind of economy. And all that data drives their power. It gives them what you might say is this issue of information asymmetries, to which we're coming now, an industrial strength sixth sense. You see further, you see better, you see more. It's very, very difficult to compete with that if you don't have that data. So what we see, how this data is used, companies that have it can use it in all kinds of ways. One of them is they can make their products better. You can simply refine your products based upon better information and the artificial intelligence, which can be driven by the data. But you can also use it to price more accurately. And you can capture consumer surplus and transfer that into producer surplus. So price discrimination tactics can be used in this data-driven economy very well. This is the Uber model, for example. I call information asymmetry the original sin of the data-driven economy, because it is inherent. The advantage of having more data gives you an unbeatable advantage. And so it becomes, as we talk about it, the new black gold. So then finally, we have a couple of other features. And one of them is the replicator economics for intangible products. I talk about machine knowledge capital, which is the end result of all the R&D and whatever, the use of data to drive new smart apps, for example. As these applications are developed, and many more, many of them are, I'm sure there are thousands under development at the moment. As they come into play and are used and are deployed, they will capture all kinds of activity that currently is being done by people. And this machine knowledge capital will compete with the human capital that we have, and it will capture market share. There will still be jobs for people, I think. Economics suggests that we will have our comparative advantage, but certainly we will be sharing the income that we currently have with machine knowledge capital, and that will intensify again the flow of money to the 1% or the 0.1% that will control this particular asset. So there we have a whole series of features of an economy, all of which tend to create tremendous advantage. It doesn't tend to create a competitive economy. In fact, each one of them drives market failure. Together, they make the data-driven economy particularly predisposed to market concentration and eventually failure and potentially abuse of that market dominance. So that creates, of course, then a lot of need for public policy. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bob to walk you through that part of it.
Okay, thanks a lot, Dan. Okay, so clearly, the pandemic has revealed to us just how important the intangibles economy is, because we've used digital technologies like Facebook and Google and Amazon and Zoom to do a wide variety of things and to carry out our daily lives. And these technologies are all based on intangible assets: the research and development, the software, brand recognition, patents and copyrights, and as Dan mentioned, very, very importantly, the data that drive them. Now, against this background, I think what COVID-19 has done is brought forward some of the important issues and risks around the uses of these technologies. Many of them are longstanding, but they've just become more apparent, I think, to everyone. And the first one I call governance. And here what I mean is, we've seen the value in trusted information, for example, given to us by our public health officers as they update us on COVID-19. And the technology and the social media platforms can get information to people at scale. But of course, they also allow mis and disinformation at scale. And we've seen the spread of misinformation, disinformation, fake cures, something the WHO has called an infodemic. And we've seen cyber attacks, ransomware on hospitals. And in fact, the Canadian Center for Cybersecurity yesterday just released a report with some what I thought were shocking statistics. They noted that as of the end of April, they were aware of 120,000 newly registered COVID-19 themed domains, a large portion of which they considered malicious or related to fraudulent activity, and noted that it's almost certain that cyber espionage directed at Canada will continue to attempt to steal Canadian IP. So that, I think, gives an idea of just the value of some of the stuff, the issues that Dan was talking about. Now, just as the social media platforms use their technology to deliver information, they are using it to take down bad information. But technology can only do so much. And the technology is generally, these providers are, usually using rules that they themselves have set, not those determined by governments. And in fact, governance in this really important area is incomplete, it's fragmented, and in some cases, it's just non-existent, both nationally and internationally. The platforms are providing important public services without the level of oversight that we would normally put in place for such services through regulation or legislation. Now, privacy and surveillance. So do you know what is happening with the data collected on you each and every time you use an app or a platform? I'm pretty sure most of us do not. The consent agreements are opaque, they're not standardized, they're difficult to enforce. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a few moments. And then the data that we provide can be used to monitor you by your employer, by government, by the platforms. And essentially, this is the business model of the platforms. It's to monetize your data. Sometimes some people refer to this as surveillance capitalism. And these large companies that have done very well through the pandemic are further cementing their market positions. Now, intellectual property, Dan has discussed it in depth. But I guess what I would point out here, one of our fellows just released a piece that talked about Canadians essentially release our IP or treat our IP as philanthropy. And with COVID-19, could we see the takeout of more innovative Canadian companies and their technologies by the large incumbents, who have large cash reserves and have done well, as I said, through this pandemic. And then finally, the future of work. We've seen how the technologies are changing the nature of work and the workplace. And we've seen, in fact, a digital divide in action, especially through this crisis. Not all the people have skills to use technologies effectively. And we've seen the safety net gaps in place and how these affect some groups more than others. And in fact, these tendencies could reinforce monopoly power and inequality. And then finally, if behavior changes fundamentally as part of the pandemic, and I think there's reasons to believe that that will be the case, then our existing rules, regulations, and laws may not be suitable or adequate. And this is taking place against what I call here the backdrop of rising geopolitical tensions around data. And I suppose that the title of this slide might seem a bit surprising and perhaps even a bit outrageous. Can data really be behind some of the tensions that we see globally? Well, I don't like the analogy too much, but data has been referred to as the new oil, and it is the fuel for artificial intelligence. And so from that perspective, this fuel is very important. Now, digital platforms that serve, with billions of users who have multiple interactions with the platforms each and every day, create billions and billions of data points daily. And those are used to develop and enhance technologies such as AI. And so from that perspective, you get a sense of the scale of the issue. And the amount of data is only going to explode with the advent of 5G around the corner. Now, where the data flow and the rules and regulations around that data, they vary tremendously. But countries that have the data want to protect it, they want to monopolize it, and they want to commercialize it. And this has led to what we refer to as these data realms that you see on the screen. So we have the US model, where open data flows get enshrined in trade agreements, like we've just about to ratify with the United States. And the trade agreement forces data to flow back to their lightly regulated de facto national champions, which reinforces their market power. Then we have the EU model, which doesn't have national champions, but instead focuses on strategic regulations to rein in the market power of platforms and promote individual rights through something you may have heard of called the General Data Protection Regulation, but which is extraterritorial in nature. And then we have China and its Great Firewall, with full data localization and a massive database of its citizens that can be used to create national champions. And this is broadly consistent with China's determination to move up the value-added chain and to become a leading standard setter, which allows it to embed its technology into the standard and disseminate its values globally, which it's doing via Belt and Road or via its dominance in various technologies like facial recognition. China now has more patents filed in AI than any other country in the world. So where does Canada fit in? Well, we're subject to both US rules via our recent trade agreement. We're also subject to the EU via GDPR. And we are impacted by China with what it does and how it develops its technology via their influence in standard setting, via the geopolitical tensions that have emanated from their global rise, and via their Belt and Road strategy. Now, data governance is very, very broad ranging. And in this slide, we divide it up into a number of different areas, which are not mutually exclusive. And what I thought I would do here is use an example. And the example I've chosen is digital contact tracing, which you may know is the use of technology to track individuals with COVID-19, with a goal to minimize the spread of the virus. There's many efforts underway and many are well-intentioned. And the focus has been on the technology. For example, is the Bluetooth signal strong enough to actually capture a contact? But the focus should be actually on the governance and the use of the technology and how it fits into the broader overall economic and health plan to reduce the spread of the virus. So let's make a heroic assumption that the technology actually works and that enough people use it. Even then, there are profound issues with respect to the collection and use of data through these types of apps. So starting with the data property rights. What are the rules on how your contact tracing data would be collected, stored, cleaned, used, anonymized, transferred, transformed, destroyed? Who would make those rules and who would enforce them? Turning to global governance. Who should make the global governance rules around these types of apps? Especially if your data flow across borders, which is likely to be the case. And how can we ensure that when data resides outside our country, that it's protected? And the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada has admitted that our existing legislation in this area is out of date. Turning to social. What else might be revealed via contact tracing? Could the location information reveal something about your physical health, your mental health, and would you want that shared? Should we allow data to be stored by gender, age, and race to help evidence-based research? Or could this lead to racial and other types of profiling, particularly if the data are not destroyed after the pandemic? Cyber. Do people fully understand the cyber risks associated with the use of an app? Will they unknowingly give out information about themselves and about others? And then commercial potential. Data, of course, has enormous, vast commercial potential, especially related to healthcare delivery and outcomes. But as I think Dan mentioned, social media platforms would love to have this data to enrich their data troves and enhance their market positions. So we need a comprehensive governance framework. And there are many efforts underway, but a lot more needs to be done. And governance needs to be wide-ranging and cross-cutting. So, for example, when we think about data governance, it needs to include policies and regulations related to competition, to foreign direct investment, to trade, to cybersecurity, to national security, and some of the other things that are mentioned in this table. And we need to be mindful of when we set rules and regulations in one particular area, that they have implications for these other areas, which is why they need to be comprehensive and thought of together. And we need to reinforce the importance of IP retention and ensure that the rules around IP don't favor large incumbents. Something called patent collectives can help here. Now, because regulations and legislation always lag technology, standards are an essential element of an agile governance framework, especially those developed in an open, inclusive, and collaborative manner. And a strategic focus on standards allows us to embed our technology and our values into the standard and export them to the world. We also need to create governance structures to harness data. As Dan said, the accumulation of data is extremely important. And so to do that, we can create data trusts for key sectors of the Canadian economy, such as oil and gas and mining, health, advanced manufacturing, and agriculture. And we also need an international framework for the governance of the digital realm because data are global in nature. And CIGI has proposed the creation of a digital stability board to develop standards, regulations, and policies across the many sectors and realms of that digital platforms touch. And then more generally, as I discussed with contact tracing, governance rules need to reflect personal autonomy as well. So finally, back to some economics. So as we get through COVID-19 and the many challenges it brings, we can't lose sight of the fact, going back to one of the slides that Dan showed, that our innovation record is poor, and we need to boost our innovation and productivity growth to help boost our living standards. So in the near term, what does that mean? Well, as we try to get through the pandemic, we need to keep in place stimulus measures and not pull them back too early or risk permanent damage that could result from firm failures and high unemployment. Now, there's a lot of discussion about the GDP ratios rising, but I think that the focus has been on the debt and not so much on GDP growth. And GDP growth is actually what services debt. And stronger conditions for growth will make debt easier to service. Now, a fiscal plan, especially one that focuses on building the productive capacity of the economy beyond the crisis, would help to minimize market concerns about rising debt levels. Now, boosting productivity ultimately requires focusing on the drivers of growth, which are on the right-hand side of the chart: human capital investment, investment in intangibles, and how we use them together, which I just coined data analytics. Too often in the past, we've assumed that technology itself will boost living standards, and that's just not true. Technology needs to be governed and effectively integrated. But as we do that, we need to be mindful of the displacement effects that can occur. And we need to put in place policies to help people move into new opportunities. We need to change our education and training systems. We need to have suitable active labor market programs. And of course, we need adequate and suitable social policies. What we've learned in the past when economies have faced such shocks like technological shocks, if people are not adequately supported, it raises inequality and leads to social strife. Now, to date, we have typically treated data as exhaust and not as a strategic asset. And going back to the discussion Dan had on the value of data, well, our statistical agency has actually tried to put a value on Canadian data. And one of the estimates it has is over $200 billion. And my view is it's probably an underestimate. Data will drive new products and new processes. We've already seen the rise of new digital industries. We've seen existing industries transformed, and we've seen others shrink in size. And COVID-19 is likely to accelerate the pace, and we need to be ready for that. So now let's take some of the governance reforms I talked about and link them directly to growth. So data is intellectual property, and data trust for strategic assets will set the rules and conditions for the use of these data in the sectors that have them. And the data can be used to improve productivity and allow the development of new products and processes. An IP strategy will encourage investment by firms and in firms. Firms that own IP are more likely to get investment, and firms that know their investments are protected are more likely to invest. IP also gives firms freedom to operate and helps them to protect and expand their market positions. Patent pools will give firms, especially small firms, freedom to operate and access to innovative technologies that allow them to scale. Standards development will benefit both will allow Canadian IP and Canadian values to get embedded into a standard, which will become a key strategic advantage for Canadian firms and allow us to capture the rents from the technologies on the global stage. Now, this may sound like industrial policy, and to some extent it is. As Dan highlighted earlier, the data-driven economy has market failures. Market failures require government action and industrial policy. And in fact, we already see the government doing this, for example, with its superclusters initiative. Then growth also needs to be inclusive. Not only have we seen the outcome when it isn't, we've seen the anti-immigration sentiments, the rise in populism, we also know that inclusion is essential for growth. We also know that people are likely to go through multiple career transitions, and we need to ensure that our education and training systems are equipped to assist that, and technology can help here. Finally, as we adapt to COVID and behavior changes, evidence-based policies will become even more important to guide policy, since past evidence may not be relevant. Big data can assist, but this requires the use of trusted data, something our statistical agency and others can help with. And then finally, we need to look for opportunities that meet multiple objectives. And I'll just throw out one example, which is clean tech. So thank you very much. I'm going to pass the floor back to Andrea to let us know what questions you might have for us.
Thank you, Bob and Dan. That was a lot of information. I'm sure there's a lot of questions kind of coming out there. It's a lot to think about. So if anyone is joining us a little bit later, at the very bottom of your screen, there's a little tab or little box that says Q&A. So if you want to, there's been a couple of questions that I've been able to answer just about the technical stuff individually, but if anyone else has any questions, there's none actually in there right now. So I'd encourage you to type them. You have both these men here ready to answer them. Oh, here, one just popped up. Walter's asking if you can comment on the effect of the Internet of Things in all of this.
Well, I can take a first run at this. So obviously, the first area of development of big data was in the big internet firms, the social media areas. But the second wave that's coming is going to be in the Internet of Things, and the number of smart devices that are being deployed is set to grow exponentially and massively. And it will be it is already, I think, the major generator of data globally, and it will completely dominate in the future. And this, of course, is going to be where the major strategic competition to control that the artificial intelligence applications that will be driven by the Internet of Things. And that, of course, is the big bone of contention between the United States and China, and with, of course, Huawei as the major Internet of Things provider being at the center of that particular storm. So it is the big thing that's coming, and it will be generating the most valuable data in the world for the next little while. And we need to somehow, in Canada, be able to both participate and try and develop the applications that will capture that value for us.
Yeah, maybe I can just add, one of the interesting things about IoT devices is there's virtually no security on them. So, that raises enormous concerns about privacy, surveillance, how the data might be used. This is an area that's ripe for misuse, and an area where we do need standards. We're thinking about this at CIGI and other organizations as well. it presents enormous opportunities, but enormous risks at the same time.
Okay, we have another question here from David. I wonder if you could comment on the emergence of laws in American states, like California, as a possible blunting of US federal government preferences for open data flows. The California Consumer Protection Law was actually modeled on the EU's GDPR and expands US citizens' privacy and data rights.
Maybe I'll start with this one. So yeah, exactly. California. Well, I think what's interesting is the backstory. As California, was working on this rule, there was a call, particularly by the platforms, to come up with a federal rule. And I think there were concerns probably about the nature of what California put in place, because it is very similar to GDPR. And then second, there is the issue of compliance, and California has one set of rules. Everyone that wants to operate in California, like in Europe, will have to follow those. But what if you get different rules in different jurisdictions? I think there is a concern there on how to comply to all these different rules and regulations. I think more fundamentally, one of the questions is GDPR, where Canada has to follow GDPR, be GDPR compliant to operate in the EU. Well, is GDPR suitable for Canada? And what does GDPR mean for Canada's ability to compete in this space? And then from a personal perspective, are the rights enshrined in GDPR ones that Canadians that we would value as well? And then, of course, taking GDPR, I mean, it's a great start, but it's not perfect. There are well-known issues with GDPR, and we'll have to see how the California Act turns out. But my guess is, once again, it'll have similar issues with GDPR, and that's one of the reasons why at CIGI we've said we really need an international structure to think about these things. We need different jurisdictions with different values to come to the table and hammer out a global framework for the digital area, because digital is pervasive globally. Data flow everywhere, and while certain jurisdictions may want to legislate in their own particular area, they do have extraterritorial implications. So we need this digital framework, and we call that the Digital Stability Board.
If I can just make one brief comment, it's on regarding the future of regulation and how, as Bob had mentioned, we have signed on to the Canada-U.S.-Mexico agreement, which has got a very strict rules regarding the application of regulations which might impede the free flow of data, and there's a complete ban on data localization requirements. Yet at the same time, we're seeing in the United States the development of regulations for first for privacy, but then there will be for national security and for many other reasons as well. So the question of what derogations from the free flow of data are going to be permitted for Canada, what's the policy space that we actually have in Canada to implement a sound data regime? That's going to be a burning issue for Canada going into the future. And of course, it's good actually that the Americans are starting to get active in this space, because whatever data regulation they carve out for themselves, that also provides us room. But we might want more. So there's a major issue there.
Thank you. We have another question here from Steph. She says, excellent presentations. Thank you very much. Great points about the importance of governance and international frameworks, but how can we reconcile the very different approaches to data flows and data protection in the Asia Pacific? Is trying to develop a common standards the only strategy?
Okay, well, since I talked about this, I'll take the first stab at this. No, actually, a really good point. And in fact, it can be done. So, for example, there's something called the International Grand Committee on Fake News and Disinformation, and it's met a number of times, and it brings together a very diverse group of countries: Canada, UK, Ireland, Malaysia, Germany, Chile, and we all in Singapore, and we all might have different views on certain things like privacy, but I think we also have a common view that something needs to be done so that these platforms that operate globally have a framework under which to operate that reflects local values that are determined by governments and politicians, not by the platforms. So it's going to be a big challenge. It can be done. One of the areas, of course, where a lot of work is being done, as you mentioned, is standard setting. And standard setting does bring a lot of different groups to the table. There have been concerns about standard setting because sometimes they're done in back rooms. And as many of us know, standards aren't really neutral. But there are collaborative ways to set standards. The CIO Strategy Council in Canada is doing this, and it can be used. They can be used once again strategically. So I mentioned that it would be good to have standards that reflect Canadian values and Canadian technology. And I do think that we had the data realms in the chart. There are a lot of countries out there that don't fit into those data realms, and I think they are looking for leadership. And I think this is where a country like Canada can make a difference, via standard setting.
So I'll add to this from a different tack, actually, and that concerns the approach to capturing value from data. Right now, the standard for data flow that Canada has signed on to, both through the Trans-Pacific Partnership and through the Canada-USMC Mexico agreement, is that of free flow, which, as Bob pointed out, that ensures that the data flows back to the major platform companies, which are American, and that's where the value is captured. Now, going forward, lots of countries are going to be interested in getting a slice of that action for themselves. If data is the new gold, the new black gold, then it should not flow across borders without any kind of royalty. So this gets us into the WTO discussions on taxation of electronic transmissions or tariffs on electronic transmissions. This is going to be coming. And the real question will be how all the smaller countries, which are not part of these major data realms, how did they actually capture that? Right now, China, of course, because of its great firewall, captures its value internally. And it's one of the very few places which has actually resisted the total domination by the American platforms. So the real question would be for everyone, how do we actually get our share of this particular pie?
Hey, we still have we only have time for one more question. There's a few more in here, but I'm going to do one that's kind of more on a local scale. So locally, this is from Dimitri. Locally here in Waterloo, there was an establishment of a big data center consortium. I think he's referring here to the Communitech Data Hub, and he was wondering what has been the progress to date on that initiative, which I don't think we are able to answer on that one. But his second part is, what other strategies does Canada have at the national level? And I think it would be nice question to finish off with.
Well, I guess my presentation is closed, but I had a slide that talked about the various strategies that are either being worked on, updated, or developed. But the one big gap for Canada is we don't have a data strategy. And that is the area that we really need to work on, a data and an AI strategy. I think one of our fellows is listening, Susan Aronson, has done some really good work in this area. And in fact, Canada is not unique to this. Many countries don't have it, but we really do need it. But kind of what Dan was saying and what I mentioned as well, when one puts together a strategy, it's not straightforward because data flow across borders, we need to think about trade. We need to think about privacy. We need to think about cyber. We need to think about national security. These all and more. All of these elements come together as part of a data governance strategy. And I think that's one reason why it's very slow to see these things get developed. But I think that it's very clear that there's an urgency to move on that.
Okay, I think we're at time right now. There's a few other great questions. This is obviously an interesting topic. I'd encourage everyone watching to check out cigionline.org because, as I mentioned, Dan and Bob have written a number of publications up there, and I'm sure there's going to be more to come as we work our way through this. So I encourage you to check that out, sign up for our newsletter to find out about publications, other events we have coming up. There's a lot we still don't know about this, and there's a lot of work CIGI is doing around this. And we're going to be doing everything we can to share as much of this information with the public as possible. I'd like to thank Bob and Dan again for your time here tonight, for your presentation, answering these questions. It's a big topic, and you did a really great job of digging into it and answering the questions. And I hope everyone has a wonderful evening. If you're joining us from somewhere where it's sunny, hopefully you get outside to enjoy the heat for another hour or two. And otherwise, we'll see you all soon. Have a good evening, everyone.